In January of 2023, 30 individuals from a variety of CLC congregations and their families made a trip to Israel. This picture gives you a perspective of the size of Israel in comparison with the Mediterranean Sea. Here is where Israel is, and this is the Mediterranean Sea basin in comparison to the United States of America. To give some perspective regarding the size of Israel and just how small this nation is, this graphic compares the nation of Israel today with Lake Michigan. This country is quite small, and the locations that we're familiar with in the Old and the New Testament are very close together compared to what we might be familiar with in our own country. On January 10th, 30 individuals flew out from the United States of America. 24 left St. Paul and Detroit and flew to Newark. Another 6 flew from Minneapolis-St. Paul to Toronto, and then we all flew to Tel Aviv. Here's our group. The larger group is the one that met in Newark. The one in the upper left-hand corner is the group that flew through Toronto. Those 6 individuals that flew through Toronto left early in the morning on the 10th and arrived in Tel Aviv on the morning of the 11th, earlier than the rest of us. The other 24 left later in the afternoon and didn't arrive in Tel Aviv until late afternoon on the 11th. Once we arrived in Tel Aviv, we made the 1-hour trip north up the shore of the Mediterranean Sea to the city of Netanya. We spent the night in a hotel in Netanya, which sat right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. Here's a picture from our hotel room. And here's a picture of the Mediterranean Sea seaboard at night. Another of the Mediterranean Sea the following morning. You can see the beautiful palm trees in the foreground with the beach just behind. 2 of our travelers went down that morning in order to take a swim. You can see Pastor Neil Radical and Alex Schmidt of Mankato as they swam in the first of 3 seas of Israel. Our first full day in Israel, we left Netanya and took a bus north along the coast of the ancient city of Caesarea Maritima. There are a couple of Caesareas, or places that are named after Caesar in this period of time. This city was called Caesarea Maritima because it was by the ocean. Now, this city was built by Herod the Great in the decades leading up to the birth of Jesus. Here's a model of what the port area of this city would have looked like in the days of Jesus. Here at the southern part, we have the main amphitheater. Next to that, we have the palace of Herod that is right built into the sea. This is the sea line. As we move further north, we come to the hippodrome, or the racetrack. And then here's the main port area. This is the port that he built from scratch, building it right out into the sea. The port had a huge impact on the economy and made Israel a very prosperous place and able to compete with other nations. This brought a lot of wealth to Herod and also for Israel. This port also had a temple built next to it, right here. Here is that same amphitheater. It was very large, a place for all kinds of entertainment. Underneath this area right here is where people could go down underneath for costumes and other supplies. You can see the stairs going down below that led to the rooms beneath. This amphitheater is 2,000 years old, but look at how well constructed it is. The acoustics here were fantastic. You could easily hear people down at the bottom all the way up at the top. Next to the amphitheater to the north was Herod's palace. We're actually standing inside where this picture was taken. This is the swimming pool area that he had built into the palace. You can still see the very foundations for it here. And here you can see part of the floor of the palace with the mosaic pattern that remains. A little further up the coast, and next to the palace, is the hippodrome, or the racetrack. Here in the distance you can see the Mediterranean Sea on the west, and over here on the east is where the spectators would sit to watch the races. The ancient city of Caesarea would have been built around all of these buildings which Herod built or constructed in order to draw people to his city. Beyond the hippodrome, we come to the port, and next to the port, a temple which Herod built and dedicated to Caesar Augustus and Roma. Here you can see a mosaic which was part of the temple. The building in the background is now a museum, but it was constructed by assimilating the ruins of the ancient temple structure. The temple was converted into a modern building, trying to keep some of the same architecture and design. You can see the difference between the old stones as well as the new stones on top. As we go inside, you can see on this outside wall the ancient stones or blocks that were used, but then on the ceiling and on the inside, the new blocks that were used in order to construct the building. Here our group is listening to a presentation on what the port would have looked like and how important that port was for Herod in his time. Herod the Great, the one who built all of this, would have been the one that killed the babies in Bethlehem because he wanted to destroy the baby Jesus. Just outside of ancient Caesarea, we found an aqueduct, which was constructed to bring water into the city of Caesarea. Caesarea was on the coast of a saltwater sea, so they needed fresh water brought in. So Herod commissioned the construction of this aqueduct to bring water from a spring to the north. As the city of Caesarea grew, they needed more water brought in to provide for the growing population. Through the arches here, you can actually see that there was a second aqueduct which was built by the Romans about 100 years later in order to double the amount of water brought into the city. From Caesarea Maritima, we traveled north up the coast to Mount Carmel. This was a very important site due to an event which took place in the days of the Old Testament during the ministry of the prophet Elijah and the days of the divided kingdom. During this time, Ahab and Jezebel ruled, and they were extremely wicked. It was here on Mount Carmel that Elijah brought the prophets of Baal and called the Lord's people of Israel to repentance. This is a monastery that's on top of Mount Carmel, and it's dedicated to the prophet Elijah. Inside the chapel, we find art that reminds us of the Lord's care of Elijah during his ministry, providing for him through ravens and giving him strength through angels. Here's a picture of the courtyard just outside the monastery, some of the places where the monks would work. You can see acacia trees and a lot of flowers in the garden area. This is a picture of the valley below Mount Carmel towards the Jezreel Valley. You can see how fertile the land was in that valley below. There's a city, Yochanim, there in the distance, which was not there during the time of Elijah. From Mount Carmel, we traveled down this mountain range to another important city of the Old Testament, the city or fortification of Megiddo. Megiddo is well known because it was a fortification at an important intersection of roads, north and south and east and west, during the Old Testament in particular. Here you can see the plain of Jezreel down below. We walked up this path to the ancient fortifications of Megiddo. This is a picture of what the gates would have looked like. These were built by Solomon, reconstructed after other nations who lived here before, like the Canaanites. 1 Kings tells us that Solomon built this structure and that he refortified the city of Megiddo in order to have a strong defense here. This is a picture of those ancient gates. These are the actual stones that were there. This gate complex was used to keep people out of the fortification and to keep guard over the valley and the trade routes that traveled through the valley. This was important both militarily as well as economically to hold this area. Here's a picture of those same gates looking back from the inside to the outside with the valley in the distance. These gates were also important because people would come here to conduct business and current events. Here we are on the top of this hill. There are thousands of years of history here. We're overlooking an ancient city. You can see some of the ruins from that time, from the time of Solomon, as well as the kings that followed him. They've done excavations here, and here they found Canaanite buildings, including a temple. This predates the time of Solomon and David and goes back to the time of Abraham. In the distance, beyond the valley, is Nazareth, way up here in the hills. Now we're going to cross through the Jezreel Valley and head up into the mountains surrounding the city of Nazareth to the hometown of Jesus. Nazareth sits in the hills on the northeast side of the Jezreel Valley. We traveled up to a place called Mount Precipice. This map gives you a picture of what you're seeing in the distance from Mount Precipice. This pool right here is the same one that you find here on the map. In the distance is Megiddo, where we just were. Over here is the modern city of Nazareth. It's quite large compared to the Nazareth of the time of Jesus. In the days of Jesus, it was just a small village. In Luke chapter 4, we are told about Jesus returning to his hometown and attending the synagogue in Nazareth. He read from Isaiah 61 and said that he was fulfilling the words of the prophet Isaiah. The people considered this blasphemy and took him out of Nazareth and onto a mountain where they were going to throw him off a cliff, but were told that he walked through their midst unharmed. This mountain is probably where that event happened. Here's another picture of the beautiful scenery from that mountain. From here we went into the city of Nazareth itself to a place called Nazareth Village. This has been constructed to give an idea of what the town of Nazareth would have been like during the days of Jesus and what life at that time would have been like. Here's a picture of a replica of a first century synagogue. This is what the inside would have been like. Notice the seats around the outside where the Jewish men would sit and listen as the Torah or the prophets were read. This also gave us an opportunity to learn about other aspects of life at the time of Jesus. Here's an old olive tree. Nazareth was known for growing olives. They would take the olives and press them in order to turn them into oil. This is an olive press, like one that would have been used during the days of Jesus. Nazareth Village also had actors in first century clothing, which gives us an idea of what life would have looked like. Here are two of them sitting with one of our travelers. The two ladies shared the Hebrew name Sarah. We also saw what the homes in the time of Jesus would have been like. This lady is working on a loom. She's taking some of the wool from sheep in order to make different types of clothing or rugs. Even though it was rainy that day, it was still an incredible visit to give us some perspective on life in first century Israel. We left Nazareth in the evening and traveled to the city of Tiberias. On the way, we traveled through the city of Cana, which is right about here. We didn't stop at Cana, but our guide did point out a church that sits at the site of the first century Jewish synagogue. It was here in Cana where Jesus performed his first miracle by turning water into wine. Here we are in the city of Tiberias. You can see the Leonardo Plaza Hotel, which is a modern hotel, but remember that Tiberias is an old city too, which was around in the days of Jesus. Here you can see an example of some of the old parts that are found in Tiberias. Tiberias sits on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee, which you can see here in the background. The following morning, we drove north up the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. Our first stop was at the Church of the Beatitudes. This little building is a chapel that was built very near to the site where it is thought that Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount. It was surrounded by beautiful gardens, and here is a picture of what the chapel looked like. In the dome of the chapel were 8 stained glass windows, each recording in Latin one of the Beatitudes which Jesus gave. Here's a picture from outside the chapel looking down into the Sea of Galilee below. You can almost see the people sitting here on the hillside as they listened to Jesus as he spoke to them the words of life. From the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee, we traveled straight north up the northern Jordan River to the ancient city of Lachish, or later called Dan. Today, this site is called Tel Dan because it is a hill in which excavations are being done to find these ancient cities. First, let's go back to the days just after the nation of Israel split into the 2 kingdoms of Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The first king of Israel was Jeroboam I. One of the things that he did was establish 2 places of worship, one in Bethel at the south and one here in Dan in the north. This is the very place where Jeroboam constructed a temple to worship a golden calf, which he called the Lord. This temple dates back 3,000 years and was a center of idolatrous worship for the children of Israel for hundreds of years, leading the people of Israel away from the true God. This is another excavation at the same Tel. This is an even older city, the city of Lachish, which goes back 1,000 years earlier than the one we just looked at. This is one of the gates for Lachish, which dates back to the Canaanite period around the time of Abraham. Here are the steps in the front that go up to the gate. Notice that this gate is made from baked dirt bricks, not rocks like the other later sites were. There is a gate in the middle which they had opened up at one time but closed up again because of how fragile this is. This was covered with dirt and was only recently discovered. This is a model of what this site would have looked like from the inside looking out several millennia ago. From Tel Dan, we drove to the nearby location of Caesarea Philippi. This was another important city in the northern region. It was originally called Paneas, but it was renamed Caesarea Philippi by Herod Philip during the time of Jesus. Here you can see a big cave right in the middle that was naturally carved out of the rock and was called the Gates of Hades. It was a pit where idol sacrifices were offered. In front of this, right here, was a temple to Caesar Augustus. To the right is a niche which was carved into the stone by hand. This was a place of idolatrous worship to the god Pan. Further to the right, other temples were constructed to various Greek and Roman gods. The temples and the places of worship were destroyed by earthquakes and are no longer standing. Even the pit behind the temple to Augustus was finally filled in. From Caesarea Philippi, we returned south, back down the Jordan River to the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee. We stopped for lunch at a restaurant on the shore of Galilee where some of our people ate what was called St. Peter's fish. St. Peter was a fisherman, and so these fish have been called by the name of St. Peter. After lunch, we took a boat ride on the Sea of Galilee. Here is the dock and a picture of a boat similar to the one we took out on the lake. The Sea of Galilee is not a very large lake. From the middle of the Sea of Galilee, you can see the shores on every side except the southernmost tip. This is looking at the hills to the northeast, and this one looks to the west. Notice the hills all the way around. The entire Sea of Galilee is surrounded by hills. This is one of the reasons why storms would often come up unexpectedly, as we hear in the Gospels. After our boat ride on the Sea of Galilee, we took a look at a boat that had been discovered. This boat dates to the time of Jesus. It was buried in mud, which protected it for 2,000 years. They were able to salvage it through a lot of work and bring it here where they put it on display. This find gives us an idea of what the boats in the time of Jesus would have looked like. Imagine Jesus sitting in this boat with Peter and Andrew and James and John as he preached to the people who were sitting on the shore and away from the pressing crowds. This was an important archaeological find that gives us a connection to history and an accurate description of the boats that Jesus would have spent time in. From here we travel back northeast around the Sea of Galilee to the city of Capernaum, which sits on the northern shore of Galilee. This was a place where Jesus spent a lot of time during his ministry. It was the hometown of 5 of his disciples. This is an interesting city because this city was not built on top of like many other ancient cities. So everything that we have here is from the time of Jesus or just after. This is the synagogue at Capernaum. The lower part was actually constructed during the time of Jesus. It was destroyed by earthquakes but was reconstructed during the Roman period. You can see the columns that are found here towards the back and all the way around. These are of Roman construction from a later date. These walls are still partially standing, but the base of this would have been the very synagogue that Jesus would have spent time in during his ministry. Since nothing modern is built over the ancient city, a lot of excavations have been done here. It gives a good idea of what the houses would have looked like in the days of Jesus. Here's another picture of part of Capernaum. In the distance you see a church that was built over the city. This church is also interesting because it was built on stilts over what tradition tells us was the very home of Simon Peter. They didn't want to disturb it, so they built a church on top of it. The church has a glass floor in the center so that you can go into the church and look down into the home of Simon Peter. The Bible tells us that Jesus performed miracles in Capernaum, one of which was the healing of Peter's mother-in-law when she had a fever. Stories were told about these miracles generations after the time of Jesus. People came to Capernaum because they had heard about these miracles that were done. This is one of the reasons why it is believed that this was the home of the Apostle Peter. From Capernaum, we returned south to the city of Magdala. This was the hometown of one of the women who followed Jesus, Mary of Magdalene. Here we see some of the recent discoveries of the ancient city of Magdala. In the background is the city's synagogue, which is covered in order to protect the excavation site. Jesus may have preached here during his ministry. This is one of the sites which helps give a picture of what the synagogue looked like in those days. This one has beautiful mosaics on the floor which date to the 1st century. You can see the walls around the outside as well as the benches where Jewish men would have sat as they listened to the reading of the scriptures. At Magdala, there's also a modern chapel that has been built, which highlights the 12 apostles as well as the many women who followed and supported Jesus during his ministry. There are many chapels around the outside of a circular narthex, which you can see here. Each chapel has a mosaic which depicts an event from the ministry of Jesus. As we enter the nave of the church, we see 12 pillars along the outside dedicated to the 12 apostles. At the front, the pulpit and the lectern are built into a boat, which is a visual reminder of how Jesus would have often preached from a boat to the people as they listened to him. This was a very beautiful church. From Magdala, we returned to Tiberias for the night. The next morning, Pastor Radical and Alex took a swim in the second Sea of Israel. Then we traveled back to the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee to visit several important churches. We began by visiting a Greek church called Tabgha, which is known as the site where Jesus fed the 5,000 with just a few small fish and a few small loaves of bread. It is also known as the Church of the Loaves. Here's a picture of the inside courtyard of this church. As we go into the nave, you can see the beauty of this church, which is constructed out of blocks. One of the interesting features here is that the baptismal font is at the entrance of the church, not near the altar or the sanctuary, as it is in many churches today. This is the way the font used to be placed in ancient churches. It was a reminder of the fact that we enter into the faith through baptism. Down the seashore, just a few hundred yards from the Church of the Loaves, is another church called the Church of the Primacy of Peter. This little church is literally right on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. You can see the church with the Sea of Galilee behind it. This is an important site because tradition holds that it was here that Jesus appeared to his disciples in the resurrection appearance to Peter and the disciples a few weeks after Easter. In the Gospel of John, it was recorded that Peter decided to go fishing with several fellow disciples. After fishing all night, Jesus called to them from the shore and asked if they had caught anything. They answered no, and Jesus tells them to cast their nets on the other side of the boat. They did so, and their nets were filled. When they came to shore, Jesus had breakfast ready. This rock is a place where Jesus would have had breakfast for them. This is the same rock inside the church. It says Mensa Christi, which means in Latin, the table of Christ. From there we continue to travel clockwise around the Sea of Galilee to the north and then down the eastern side. During the time of Jesus, this would have been a Gentile region. It would have been in these hills where Jesus would have come and cast the demons out of Legion. He gave them permission to enter pigs, which then ran off a cliff. This was not a Jewish region, but Gentile. Jesus did spend some time here in the region of Decapolis, as it is often called in the Gospels. We are coming down the eastern shore of the Sea of Galilee until we come to the southern Jordan River Valley. We then follow the Jordan River south before heading west to another location in the Old Testament called Gideon Springs. Tradition holds that this was the place where Gideon gathered his army to fight the Midianites, but God told him it was too many. His army was reduced to 300 by seeing how they would get down to drink out of a stream. This is the stream that comes out of the spring, and here are two individuals reenacting the lapping of the water at Gideon Springs. From here, we turn east to go to Beit Shean. This is important for a variety of reasons. On the top of this mountain in the distance is the place where Saul and his sons were hung after they died in battle. Here in the valley was a city that was constructed by the Romans during their occupation of Israel. And right here is a model of what that city would have looked like, based on what we hear from Josephus as well as what we learn from the excavations. At one time, this entire city was completely buried in dirt, but it's just recently been uncovered, and they've been able to see what a Roman city in Israel at the time of Jesus would have looked like. Here is the main street, right down the middle, with a bathhouse over here on the left, an agora in the distance, or a marketplace, and then an amphitheater over here on the right. There were temples and there were houses scattered throughout this area of Beit Shean. This is a picture of the same city from the hill where Saul and his sons were hung, looking back to where we were in the distance over here. You can see the buildings that have been toppled by a number of earthquakes which took place in this part of the world. This is a picture of the inside of the bathhouse. They would heat up the water and the floor, and the people would come here in order to relax and to clean up. From Beit Shean, we continue southwards towards the Dead Sea. This is a picture of what the Jordan River Valley would have looked like. It was a very lush place during the days of Jesus and the days of the Old Testament, and it's still lush and fertile yet today. From the Jordan River Valley, we are finally going up to Jerusalem, quite literally. Jerusalem sits on a hill about 3,000 feet above sea level. Here's an overview of modern-day Jerusalem from Mount Scopus. All of this modern city is Jerusalem. In the distance, you can see the ancient city of Jerusalem. As we zoom in closer, we see the Dome of the Rock with its golden cap. This is a Muslim holy site, which sits on the Temple Mount where Solomon and later Herod would have built the temple. You can also see the ancient wall of Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem, which was built by the Turks during the time of the Crusades. Inside that wall would have been the ancient city of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus. We settled into a hotel in Jerusalem that night, and the next day we visited Old Jerusalem. We started with a visit to the Temple Mount. This, in front of you, is the Western Wall. The original wall was built by Herod the Great, and since the Muslims controlled the actual mount, this is as close as the Jews can get to the actual site of where the temple would have been built, right up here on the other side of this wall. This is why the Jews will come to this portion of the wall down here to pray. Notice the difference in the rocks and how part of that wall at the top was rebuilt. We were able to go up on the Temple Mount. Christians and Jews are not allowed to pray there, but we could go up as visitors to look at it. Here is the Dome of the Rock, a very beautiful structure, and yet how sad to see that such a structure is dedicated to the false god, Allah. The Jews have been given also permission to dig underneath this very mount, since they can't go up on the Temple Mount itself. In this process, they've actually uncovered a lot of things from the past. They've rebuilt places where they can pray in these underground spaces next to the Western Wall. This is an example of a prayer site underground, which the Jews use for prayer. We visited the site of Ecce Homo. Beneath this church, they have uncovered the place that was called the pavement in the Gospels. This is where they would have come to bring Jesus in order to have him tried. Underneath this piece of glass, they've uncovered a game carved into the floor which was played by Roman soldiers while they were watching over prisoners. This whole complex has been dug out and uncovered so that we can still visit it today, 20 feet underground. These are sites that would have existed during the days of Jesus. We also visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is one of the sites that tradition holds was a place where Jesus was crucified and then buried. Here's one of the shrines inside this church. The church is shared by a variety of denominations, including Catholics, Greek Orthodox, and Protestants, and even a Muslim mosque is attached to the church. From Jerusalem, we head south to the little city of Bethlehem, the birthplace of Jesus. This is the Church of the Nativity, which was built on the site where Jesus is thought to have been born. This is a Greek Orthodox church, and you can see some of the icons in the background. The church was built over the birth site, and we went down underneath the church to a little grotto where Mary placed Jesus in the manger. This is what the modern city of Bethlehem looks like today. It's very large compared to the little town that we sing about in our Christmas hymns. And over here in the distance is where we're going to head next, to the place of the Church of the Shepherd's Fields. The very first people to whom God announced the birth of Jesus was to shepherds living out of Bethlehem. This little church is dedicated to the shepherds who heeded the word of the Lord and went not only to see but to worship the baby Jesus, their Savior. Inside this beautiful chapel, the words of the angel recorded in Luke chapter 2 are found in Latin: "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men." On the next day, we traveled south along the Dead Sea to En-Gedi. This is a place mentioned in the Old Testament where David hid from King Saul. There was a ravine between these steep hills with natural caves all over. You can see how this would be a good place to lay low and hide from Saul. It provided for them a place to hide, but also gave them fresh water, as there were streams that formed through the mountains of En-Gedi. There was also a lot of wildlife, such as mountain goats, which would have provided food. Here is our group in the hills of En-Gedi. Next, it was north to the caves of Qumran. These are important for an archaeological reason. It was in Qumran where in the 1960s a multitude of ancient scrolls were discovered, including Old Testament scriptures. You can see the caves built into the hills in the distance. As they started to find these scrolls, they also discovered a settlement of the Essenes. Now, this group is not mentioned in the New Testament, but Josephus and other writers speak about this religious group of leaders called the Essenes. They were a group similar to the Pharisees or the Sadducees. They did a lot of writing and copied the scriptures well as other important documents. And then they stored them in these jugs and hid them away in caves, possibly to keep them from the Romans or from other groups. These scrolls were stored and then lost for thousands of years. They're important because they validate what we have in the Old Testament scriptures from much more recent manuscripts, and they tell us that they are accurate. These are some of the oldest original manuscripts of the Old Testament, and they show that the Old Testament scriptures have not changed over the years. Here's an excavation of the Essene settlement. They had bathing areas and houses and places where they worked. Next, we traveled north to Jericho, where we took a cable car up into the mountain. This is known as the Mount of Temptation, the site where tradition holds that Jesus was tempted by the devil by showing him all the kingdoms of the world and promising that he would give it to Jesus if he would just bow down and worship him. This Greek Orthodox monastery is dug right into the side of this hill. It was remarkable. You can see the steps going up from down here, zigzagging and up into the monastery. There are rooms built right into the outside of the rock where the monks would stay. This is the hallway, with the mountain on the right and the buildings on the left, hanging right over the mountain. This is a chapel at the monastery of the Mount of Temptation. Again, you can see the Greek Orthodox style, which is very different from Roman Catholic or from Protestant. On our way back down, we went right over the ancient city of Jericho. Here's an aerial photo of the site of ancient Jericho. We didn't take this, but it shows us what the site would have looked like. And this is one of the gates of Jericho. This dates back to the time of Joshua, very old, about 4,000 years or so. From Jericho, we head back down to the Dead Sea. The water level of the Dead Sea has dropped significantly in the last 100 years since they dammed up the Sea of Galilee and they pump water out of the Jordan River for irrigation. So the water level continues to go down and the salt level continues to rise. Members of our group had the opportunity to float in the Dead Sea. Pastor Radical and Alex took a dip in the third sea of Israel. After our time in the Dead Sea, we drove back to Jerusalem for the evening. The next day, we went back to the old city of Jerusalem. This is the old city of Jerusalem right here within the walls, which the Turks built surrounding the city. Right here is the Temple Mount, and here is the Kidron Valley, which separates it from the Mount of Olives over here. Another important site in the Gospels is the Garden of Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives. We visited a church which is called the Church of the Agony, or the Church of All Nations. It's called the Church of All Nations because a lot of different nations helped to provide funding to build this church, but its traditional name is the Church of the Agony. It is here that Jesus came to the Garden of Gethsemane and agonized over the impending cost of the work of redemption which his Father had given him to do. In the painting behind the altar we see Jesus praying to his Father that this cup might be taken from him, yet not his will, but his Father's will be done. Then an angel comes to give him strength. In the background you can see the three disciples, Peter, James, and John, sleeping. This is another picture of the Church of the Agony, right here through the narrow passageway. Here's the Garden of Gethsemane. Some of these olive trees are very old and possibly ones that would have existed during the time that Jesus spent there. We walked further up the Mount of Olives to a cemetery that overlooks the Kidron Valley. This is the oldest Jewish cemetery in the world. We learned about some of the unique Jewish practices related to death and burial. This is the Kidron Valley, with the Mount of Olives here on the left, as well as the cemetery that we visited, and on the right we have the Temple Mount. We crossed over the Kidron Valley from the Mount of Olives back into Old Jerusalem and what is called the City of David, right in this area here. The City of David in this part is the oldest part of Jerusalem, dating back over 3,000 years. We visit the ruins of the Palace of David and his descendants, as well as other buildings. Here's a model of what one of the houses would have looked like, and the ruins that we can see right there. Then we walked through some of the tunnels underneath the ancient city of David and the waterways and the passages that were used to get water in and out of the city. We started at the top and came down to the Pool of Siloam. This was only discovered about 8 years ago, and now they are beginning to work on excavating the rest of the Pool of Siloam. This pool is mentioned in the Gospels of John, where Jesus sent the blind man to wash. After trekking through more tunnels back to the top, we went back to the Temple Mount. This is the southern corner of the western wall, which we saw earlier. When the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the temple, they knocked the walls over. You can see the rubble which fell into the street below. This is a street traveled by the pilgrims to Jerusalem, but it's been collapsed by the stones from the wall above. Right here are ancient marketplaces where the people would sell pigeons and doves and sheep for sacrifice. In the days of Jesus, there was an arch over these markets that connected the city right here to the Temple Mount. You can still see the arch where it connected and the stairway, which people would have taken from the city up to the Temple Mount. This is where Jesus said that the people should be buying and selling instead of conducting business on the Temple Mount itself, in the court of the Gentiles. Here's another picture of the western wall, the nearest place to where the Temple of Herod would have been. People also call it the Wailing Wall. From the Temple Mount, we travel outside the ancient walls of Jerusalem to another one of the sites that has been suggested as a site of the death and burial of Jesus. This location is often known as Gordon's Calvary. What was interesting about this site is how visual it is. This is a 1st century tomb, So whether it is the actual tomb of Jesus or not, it at least gives us a good picture of what a tomb during the time of Jesus would have looked like. It is also in a garden, just as described in the Gospels, and it seems to match what we are told by the Gospel writers. The following day, we visited a model of first century Jerusalem. This is an incredible scale model showing what the city of Jerusalem would have been like at the days of Jesus. Here are the walls that surrounded Jerusalem. This down here is the city of David, the oldest part of Jerusalem. The rest of Jerusalem was built up and around it. This is the temple complex, which was built by Herod. Notice how important religion was for the Jews of Jesus' day when you compare the size of the temple to the rest of Jerusalem. This right here is the fortress of Antonia, which is where the soldiers stayed in order to make sure that everything was kept peaceful. Over here in the distance would have been where Caiaphas' house would have been and where Jesus would have been tried. This helps us to put everything into perspective. From here we traveled to the Shrine of the Book. This is the top of the museum, which is actually underground. This is a museum to all of the writings related to the Old Testament. One of the documents on display is the scroll of Isaiah found as part of the Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran. This is not the original, but a replica, but it shows us what the original Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah looks like. In the lowest level of the museum, they have a series of displays that tell about the Codex Aleppo, which is another important Old Testament document. From here, we traveled west to the Valley of Elah. This is where David killed Goliath. Here Goliath came out to mock the children of Israel and blaspheme the Lord. So David came out to do battle against Goliath. He took a couple of stones with his sling and killed Goliath. There was no monument or anything like that here, but you can visualize where the Philistines had their army lines on the southwest and the Israel camp was on the northeast of the valley. This is what the valley looks like. Here's a picture of that valley itself. Imagine the Philistines in the distance. And here's a picture of the valley from the other direction. From the Valley of Elah, we continued northwest to the city of Jaffa for our last night. This was significant for a number of reasons. It's mentioned several times in the book of Acts. This church is known as St. Peter's Church. It is connected with the place Peter stayed with Simon the Tanner next to the sea when Cornelius sent men from Caesarea. This is right on the Mediterranean Sea. In the distance here, you can see the city of Tel Aviv. After supper in Jaffa, we dropped off 16 people at the airport to return home, while the rest of us returned to Jerusalem. The next morning, 4 more headed to the airport to return home, and the rest of us traveled across the border into the country of Jordan. We crossed over the border and the Jordan River using the Allenby Bridge. Our first stop in Jordan was Mount Nebo, the place where God allowed Moses to look over the Jordan River Valley and see the Promised Land. Moses wasn't allowed to enter it, but he was able to see it. Here you can see the Dead Sea in the Jordan River Valley, with Jericho here and Jerusalem in the distance. It was here that the Lord buried Moses, his servant. Several churches and monasteries were built on this site over the centuries, but were destroyed by earthquakes. The church that stands here now was built over the site of 3 previous churches. You can see the older churches existing on the bottom and the newer rock on top. As we look at the inside of the building, we can see that it is full of original mosaics that tell the stories of the Bible in picture. This is the sanctuary at the front of the church, and again the back wall. You can see the old stones on the bottom with the newer stones on top. From Mount Nebo, we traveled south along the eastern side of the Dead Sea to a place called Macarius. On this hill overlooking the Dead Sea Valley, Herod the Great built another palace. The road going up to the top is still visible. This site was important because it was here that John the Baptist was put to death, as Herod granted the request of Salome. This is the place where Herod's palace would have been. It was destroyed, and later a church was built on the site. That church was also destroyed by an earthquake. And these are the ruins of those two locations. From Macarius, we continued our travels south, all the way down along the Dead Sea and much further south to the city of Petra. Petra was important not so much for any biblical reasons, but for some archaeological reasons. It was settled by the Nabateans, who were the descendants of Esau. This was a natural rock fortress city that was finally conquered by the Romans in 105 AD. We walked through the monstrous rock pathway, or Seek, until it finally opened up and gave us our first view of what has been called the Treasury. This is the best known building in Petra. This is a better view of it once you come out of the rock passageway. This and all the other buildings here were carved into sandstone. This was actually a tomb for an important Nabatean family. It had 3 levels: ground level, second story, and a recently discovered level below ground. You can see where the scaffolding was placed in order to carve this out of the rock along the edges. This angle shows you how it was actually carved right out of the stone from above. Very beautiful and very intricate work. Inside Petra there are even more tombs. This whole place was like a giant graveyard. All of the buildings you can see were carved out of sandstone and were tombs for different important individuals of the Nabateans. Here are some more important tombs in Petra. Drew Nauman is standing in front of one of them. When Petra was conquered by the Romans in 105 AD, we begin to see a change in construction styles. Now we see buildings that are built, not carved. We find Roman columns and buildings constructed with blocks. In the background, you can see the Nabatean construction carved out of rock, whereas the Romans were builders. Here we found a temple built by the Romans after they conquered the people of Petra. Just outside of Petra, we stopped at a place called Wadi Musa, or the Waters of Moses. There's a tradition that says that this is where Moses struck the rock to bring forth water for the people of Israel. There is a rock here, and underneath the rock there's a spring that continues to give water even to this day. The locals come to fill containers of water in order to take it back home. This building was built over the top of it, a reminder of how God provided for his people. This is just inside the modern city of Petra. Not too far from here is the actual burial place of Aaron. We left Petra to travel north again along the Dead Sea, way to the north to the city of Amman. This is the region where the Ammonites would have lived during the time of Moses. This was a Canaanite nation. We stayed at the Amman International Hotel for our last night. In our last day in Jordan, we traveled south to Madaba. In Madaba, there's a church dedicated to St. George. We know him best from English lore and the killing of the dragon. There are all kinds of mosaic pictures inside this church to St. George, which is another Greek Orthodox church. The most important part of this church is the mosaic on the floor, which dates to the 4th century AD. It's a picture of the Holy Land from the time of Jesus. It has been used to find locations of great importance. That map has been shown to be extremely accurate in finding ancient sites. After this visit, we headed back across the Jordan River through the Allenby Bridge and back into Israel. This is a picture of the southern part of the Jordan River at the border crossing. This is between Jordan on one side and Israel on the other. The Jordan River doesn't look like much now. It's pretty dried up. You can see the vegetation in the middle, but you can also see what it would have looked like before they drained all the water off. We crossed back over into Israel and had our last lunch at a winery between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. We had bread and olives, cheese and wine. Then we returned to Tel Aviv for our farewell dinner, and then back to the airport for our flight home. As we think about the importance of this trip, we are reminded of how Jesus truly did live and was born in the city of Bethlehem. He traveled and preached for 3 years, teaching and performing miracles. At the end of that 3 years of ministry, this one who was born to be both true God and true man gave his life on Calvary for the sins of mankind. On the third day, he rose again from the dead, declaring his victory over sin, death, and the power of the devil. All of that reminds us of how important everything that we have seen truly is, and that God has accomplished those things for us. Paul says, "For whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope."